Here we go. So we are now recording. So Andrea, welcome. We're so glad you're here with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
And so as you can all see behind me, I have the covers of the two books we're going to be talking about tonight. Andrea Williams is originally from Kansas City, now lives in Tennessee, and worked for a time at the Negro Leagues Museum, which I'm sure we're going to hear about tonight a little bit, and now is a full-time writer and professor, teaches writing, and lives in Tennessee. And
I don't teach writing, but that is cool. I don't know how that found its way into the bio, but I definitely don't teach writing.
I thought that was part of our conversation the last time. So, all right. But full-time writer is what you are doing now, right?
Yes, that's true.
So, and here's Dr. Brinson coming now. And so Dr. Brinson will be joining us here momentarily. And Andrea has written a number of books on different historical topics, on the civil rights movement, some, right, in terms of some other interesting. And so, Andrea, I'd be interested in you telling us a little bit about how you got interested first and foremost in writing.
Ooh. I always wrote, when I was a kid. My mom didn't save pictures that I drew. She saved like short stories and things that I wrote, and she still has them actually. So it was just always, even as I, envisioned taking other career paths, I wanted to be the first female general manager of a Major League Baseball team, but I always said that I would also write for ESPN, the magazine, on the side. So the writing was always there. Went to undergrad at Georgia Southern and studied sport management, and, wrote for our sports page and for our student newspaper, and, got to the Negro Leagues Museum. And such a big part of my job was writing, in marketing and development. We're a nonprofit, so everybody's wearing many hats. So PR, press releases, and, the annual report, and, the letters that we would send out to members to try to get them to, buy a yearly membership in exchange for, a hat signed by Buck O'Neill, like all that stuff. I was doing. And so, when I decided to leave the museum, I was having babies at that point. Writing was the first thing that I was like, okay, because I am definitely, the ambitious, career-oriented person. So it was never just going to be the babies ever. But that was the thing, writing was the thing that I could do, and still, be a mom when they were really, really young. And I wanted to be, nursing and doing all that stuff. So,
well, and I believe, if I remember correctly, that at one point you were interested in being the first female GM in baseball.
Yes, that was the plan. I mean, I came right out of undergrad and planned to, like, I already had like all the letters of recommendation and everything, because I was going to go right into grad school and get a dual like JD MBA, and got the job at the museum. And like, here we are, because it was like, I don't know that I want to do this anymore. And, again, got married and started having kids and all that. But yeah, I said that, even though I definitely felt like I wouldn't actually be first. Like when I was an undergrad, Kim Ng was at the Yankees, and I'm like, surely this woman is going to get the GM, but like next couple of years, here we are. Yep. And it took until 2020. So
yeah. But I'll root for the Miami Marlins.
I know, right? Like I feel like we talked about that when we spoke before. No, because that was too early, was it? I don't know. But yes, I definitely, when they came in as the expansion team with the Rockies, my dad and I picked a team, and we like kind of had like an informal bet of like, well, which team is yours and who's going to win the World Series first? And so I picked the Marlins, I won. And I had like a little, I had the cup, like one of the little, what do we call them? The squirt cups with the little flexi straw thing.
Oh yeah. Okay.
On it. I had a hat, like the whole nine. So I think all that stuff is still in Kansas City at my mom's house, but happy to root for the Marlins again for sure.
All right. Welcome, Dr. Brinson. We're glad that you can join us.
Thank you.
Wonderful to have you here with us tonight, too. Dr. Brinson is joining us. I'm glad it worked. Dr. Brinson, of course, is a professor at Missouri State in early childhood education and a community activist, done a variety of writing as well. And so I'm going to start with the same question for you, Dr. Brinson, that I just gave to Andrea, as you're both joining us. What got you started in writing?
Basically, my answers probably shadow hers. When I started learning how to walk, I started learning how to doodle and wanting to read. And I think I have literally, I love reading so much, I would read a cereal box top when I was sitting at the breakfast table. And I still remember, this goes back a ways, when every once in a while in school, you got to order books. And I was just so excited to order all of these different titles. And because of that, because I was so engaged and I love the characters, of course, my imagination is creative. And I start to say, you know what, I've got all of these characters and stories living in my head. So that is what started me to writing.
That's awesome. I think we can all relate a little bit to that. But tonight we're here to talk about two very specific books that have come out recently. We have Andrea Williams' book on baseball's leading lady about Effa Manley, and Dr. Brinson's book about the Dolly Vardens, a 19th century Black women's baseball team. And so before we get into the specifics of your books, I'd like to ask you both the other sort of larger question, which is, how'd you get interested in baseball? So Andrea, I'm going to start with you and then we'll go to Dr. Brinson.
Yeah, I grew up, I was coming of age as a kid in the 90s, and it was like, I mean, baseball was great then, to be honest. I mean, my Twitter page, like, it's King Griffey Jr. So getting into baseball was not difficult. The Royals, being a Royals fan was a challenge, during a lot of those years, but there was always the Mariners, even though they let me down every single year. But it was just the thing that, like, I did with my dad. He taught me like the numbers of the field positions, like all that's, my first game that I got on Nintendo was Bases Loaded. So it was just always there. And yeah, the more I got into it, I played softball, but by high school was really more interested in like the business side of it. So I'd be at a game and like, okay, is anybody making money off of that signage in outfield? Like, those were the questions that I was asking. So yeah, I was just that kid that was like, the game is fun. There's other stuff going on behind the scenes too. So.
And Sabrina, Dr. Brinson, your interest in baseball.
Okay, so mine is a little different. I basically grew up in a football family. Every guy in my family played football, but just in general, growing up, they all did the little league things and that sort. And in addition to that, actually, little league baseball was really big in my area. I'm from Tampa, Florida, and the little league baseball teams were always amazing, and as in they always, played in the championship games. And I actually went to school with Dwight Gooden. So both baseball has kind of always been a part of my childhood through the little league, and then just kind of following up with that with others who I know in baseball. But I'm not a baseball fan per se, with it just in general, but I am a fan of the amazing, wonderful women who have played in baseball and who have managed baseball. And then, of course, some of the amazing men who've never really gotten the recognition that they needed, like in the Negro Baseball Leagues.
Great. So, given your backgrounds and your interest in all of these things, I would ask the question, how did you come across the stories that you decided to tell? And why did you decide to tell these particular stories? And so I'm going to start this time with Dr. Brinson. How did you come across this story about the Dolly Vardens, and how did this story capture your interest?
So again, it goes back to what I said. For me, I understand how important culturally responsive literature and culturally sustained literature is. And especially in history. When we talk about American history, so much of American history has not been told. When you talk about the amazing accomplishments of people from diverse populations. And so that was my goal, again, going back to my childhood and my love of reading and writing. It's so important because reading is integrated into everything. I started to notice that there was that big deficit. And so my goal was to go back and say, let's start researching some of this history and bringing it forward. And again, going back to my connection with the Little League and with the baseball players that I knew, I started really getting interested in the Negro Baseball Leagues. And so once I started researching some of those things, and I came across some of the other women who were in it, like Connie Morgan and Mamie Peanut Johnson and Toni Stone. I thought, wow, this is really amazing that we have these three players in Negro baseball leagues that nobody knows about. And so, of course, that made me wonder. I said, I bet you there are some other amazing teams. Not a lot is known about the Philadelphia Darling Vitings, but that is how I started to research it, just to find out if I could identify others who were involved in baseball. And that came to my discovery of the Philadelphia Darling Vitings.
That's awesome. And it just reminds us of the importance of just being curious. And so, exactly. Andrea, how did you come across and decide that this was a story you had to tell about Effa?
Yeah, I started working, as I mentioned, at the Negro Leagues Museum right out of undergrad. And the very first day, Bob Kendrick, who's the president of the museum now, gave me a tour. And, if you haven't been there, it's set up chronologically. So you have to learn the history of Black baseball before you're able to take the field of legends, with all these life-size bronze statues of players like Satch and Josh and Oscar Charleston. But as you walk through, there's this like picture in the corner of Effa and her husband Abe. And at this point I am still like, okay, I'll be here for a year maybe, and then I'm on my way to grad school so I can get to that front office, because I was, I wanted to be a Black woman working in a baseball front office. And so I saw her picture and it just immediately stood out to me, because obviously she did, I didn't know what she did immediately, but obviously her picture being there means that she did something. The museum isn't very big, so there's really nothing wasted there in terms of photos and artifacts and things like that. So I started asking, I asked Bob who she was, and then started researching and doing my own study about who she was. We actually had a copy of her book that she wrote as one of the artifacts in the museum, so I kind of hijacked that for a little bit. I read it a few times. And then, so I wish, it wasn't an immediate thing for me. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, this woman's story is incredible and I need to write the book. There's a lot of in between, like 14, 15 years of in between of, me leaving the museum and starting a family. And then when I first got into writing, it was journalism first. And then it was ghost and co-writing, to your point, Leslie, about some of the other stuff that I've done. But I say that Effa's spirit was kind of with me all the way. Like, you got to write the book. And by this point, with having kids, to Dr. Brinson's point about seeing some of these gaps that we have for literature for kids, my oldest is 13 now. My kids all really, they're really great readers. But my 13-year-old is the kid that, like, we are going to the library weekly and buying books weekly, and she's blowing through like 2 or 3 a day, like, not related, but we're in that weird part of like, she's like between middle grade and YA, but the YA is like a little more mature. And so I'm trying to like read in advance of her to see, but I can't keep up because she's going through like 2 or 3 books a day. So, but she doesn't read any nonfiction. And so I was like, I'm talking to her about this, like, what is going on? Why are you not reading more nonfiction? And she's like, Mom, it's boring. It's not, there's not a lot of it, to begin with. And then, whatever is out there. And I don't want to, I'm not throwing any other, kids, nonfiction authors under the bus, but there's definitely a gap. Like there's just not a lot of it. And it's just, I always say that, in the world of literature, of all of the books, and I do other things too, but for this to be like my first solo project, I picked like the least sexiest thing that I could have picked. Like, if I was going to write for kids, it could have been like YA fantasy, and maybe I would have got the big splashy, like 7-figure deal, but I picked middle grade nonfiction. Right. But But yeah, thinking about, filling in those gaps in the story that I wish that I would have had when I was, my daughter's age. And, I found my way to this goal of being in a front office kind of on my own, but, hoping to open up a world of possibilities for kids, for young women, for young Black women who didn't even know it was possible, for young Black men. If we look at the landscape in Major League Baseball right now, I think, already it's kind of a stretch, right? Like I've got 4 kids. My youngest 2 are boys, and they are finally like, okay, yeah, I'm into this baseball thing, right? Like my 9-year-old wants to win a World Series, a Super Bowl, and an NBA championship. So he's there, right? But it took a little while. Like this is not the era of Ken Griffey Jr. anymore. So even getting him to see himself on the field is a bit of a stretch. But certainly when we talk to the ownership box, when we talk to the front offices, it's not there at all. So I want kids really, I want to introduce them to this untold, these untold stories from our history, but also to really, like I said, open up the realm of possibility for what they can do, with their own career. Sure, you can be the next Satchel Paige or the next Josh Gibson, but you can also be the next Effa Manley or the next Ruth Foster or Gus Greenlee.
If you don't see it, you can't be it, kind of an idea.
Right.
So, okay. Dr. Brinson, your book is also aimed at a younger audience. And I was watching we have some librarians on this call, and I know they were just loving what you were just saying. But Dr. Brinson, you also chose to write for a younger audience. Why did you choose to take that particular approach with your book as well?
Because it is so important. People are now finally understanding that the sooner you start to introduce children to reading and writing and literacy, hopefully the more they'll be engaged in it. And I think that people still just don't understand how strong that connection is to the other major content areas like math and science and those kinds of things. And so for me, it was really important to say, we say it all the time to our parents, read to your children all the time, read to your children, but we forget to tell them why. And then it goes back to what Andrea says too. A lot of times there's not the substance of the writing. It's not something that they can connect to. And so for me, my goal was to do both, as I said, to fill in some of those gaps, particularly in history, but also to do it in an intriguing way. And one of the main reasons really goes back to my other research when we look at the lack of reading, because we know now how important reading is, so much so. For me, I was invested in particularly with diverse populations, because some states actually look at 3rd grade reading scores to decide how many prisons they're going to need when those children are 18. And we are now building more prisons than we are schools. And so that is a huge crisis. And so my goal is to come on this side, because I do those trainings about the school to prison pipelines, but now it's to come onto this side to really get people to understand just how important it is to motivate our children to read earlier. And as I said, with the prison pipeline, it really targets 4 of our groups. So those 4 groups would be children of color, particularly our African American and Latino American males. It is children who live below the poverty level, children who are in foster care, and children with special needs. And I'll take it a step further, because as I said, we're now building more prisons than schools. And guess what? Most of those prisons are being run by private organizations. Okay, so let's really look at how ugly that can become. What do I mean by that? If I'm a business owner, I'm in business to do what? Make a profit. And so what is the best way to make a profit? The free labor of people who are in prisons. And so for me, it was really important to say, let's get in now and get them motivated to read. That's something that I think a lot of people don't understand. I think I told you, I loved reading and writing. As I said, I read cereal box tops. Well, I'm not the one, who might be in jeopardy because of that. So for me, it was like, okay, the ones like me who love reading, that's fine, that's great. But what about the children who aren't motivated to read? And we talk about that, that's called illiteracy. I may have the skills to read, but I lack the motivation. And so again, my goal was to say, let me provide some reading content that they're going to be motivated to read. And what do we know? We know that children connect with reading that is meaningful things that have reflections of themselves. And so again, that is why I wanted to start with that younger audience to really get them engaged. And it really kind of does a couple of things. They're getting the reading and the writing skills, plus they'll have the skills to be able to be successful in the other content areas like the math and the sciences and those kinds of things.
And that's such a powerful thing to hear in terms of both of you think. And so something, listening to both of you, I want to ask you this question. You both focused on a topic, baseball, right? Which is, we typically see stories that are written about predominantly male players, right? And yet you both chose to look at the participation of women. And so I want to ask you, how important was it to tell those stories about women's participation in baseball, since that kind of goes against the predominant story? And so I throw that out to both of you to see what your thoughts are on that.
Same thing, it's gaps, it's filling in those gaps. It's letting people have a heightened awareness. And as I said, too, going back to those agendas, yes, it's important for people to have reflections of themselves, but they also need to have insight into the lives of others. And so again, just like we want to make sure that they have a heightened awareness about amazing things that people from diverse populations do, there does tend to be a tendency when it comes to sports, particularly baseball, to focus on the males. And as Andrea said, I too thought, you know what, when I came across the story of the Philadelphia Daughter Barbershops, I wanted people to know that yes, back then, even during Reconstruction, you had women who were strong, skilled athletes. And I also took that opportunity to kind of deliver that message. Andrea talked about that as far as saying the message is you can, these things that they did are great, but you can do some things too. And that's one of the messages of my book. I wanted to make sure that they saw this is not, oh, no, girls just kind of running around. No, they were strong, skilled athletes. And in the story, the readers also get to see that they had problems that they had to overcome. And so in the story, that's why I made it intergenerational with this little girl who had a problem. And so I wanted to also point out how you can take a positive avenue to really work through things to get to whatever your goals are. So those are basically my reasons and why I think it's so important. Because again, we just don't hear enough of those stories. But I will say, and I think we all can agree, in 2021, everybody should step carefully because glass ceilings are shattering everywhere when it comes to women.
Absolutely. Andrea, your thoughts on the importance of telling a story like Effa's?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I'm going to echo a lot of what Dr. Brinson said. It's definitely filling in those gaps. It's making sure that, like I said, I just remember, growing up, and I would have loved to have had a story like this. I think for me, it's important, particularly when we're talking about Effa, because Effa wasn't the first woman to own, a baseball team. But she was really significant in the role that she played, in that she was running this business on the day-to-day, right? So, and as we talk about, and for those who haven't read my book, it's Effa's story, but there's also a lot of other stuff in it too. And so it gives me an opportunity to talk about, these other things that are just as important, talking about the history of the Negro Leagues overall. And I think, I've been sharing, in interviews promoting the book, that Effa's success is really a reflection of the significance of the Negro Leagues overall. Like, Effa can still be Effa, but if we don't have the Negro Leagues, we don't have Effa Manley in the Hall of Fame. We don't have Effa Manley in Cooperstown. It is because of this institution that was created that she even has the opportunity to run a baseball team, to build this Hall of Fame level career. The women who came before her, particularly the white women that were in Major League Baseball, they had to hire a president who did the day-to-day stuff. They had to put the men around them who would actually make those decisions. So, in telling Effa's story, we get, the significance, the historical significance of the Negro Leagues. We get to talk about what is possible for kids, today and tomorrow, if we know what we were able to accomplish in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And we also get to show women that like you can be really powerful. Like she ran this team. She was also a really integral part of the operations of the Negro National League on the whole. These men turned to her when they wanted to write a letter to Happy Chandler to protest Branch Rickey stealing players. Like they came to Effa and asked for that. So yeah, it's filling gaps and also filling the gaps from history of the past, but then also how do we move forward and create a better future.
And both of you focusing on this importance of telling this larger historical piece, right? And you do it in two very different ways. And so, Dr. Brinson, I'm also curious if you could talk a little bit about what it was like working with your illustrator on your book, because the illustrations are such a huge part of your book as well. And so, can you tell us a little bit about that process?
I actually was very fortunate because, sometimes you don't get to do that, but that story is interesting in and of itself. And it really I can take off where Andrea left off with that part. As you said, I do a lot in the community. And so 2020, it happened to have been, the centennial anniversary of Negro League Baseball. And so for me, I really wanted to highlight that and to celebrate that. And in the community, I did a lot of things. I didn't want to just do this just one little celebration, but I looked at the whole year to really educate people on the Negro Baseball League. And as Andrea says, all the different players who were in it. And so it just so happens that before that, we were doing the Jackie Robinson Day. And I reached out to the community and I said, does anybody know an illustrator, somebody who can do kind of some of our caricatures of Jackie Robinson, because I was doing educational things on him. And so Mark actually kind of answered the call. And so when it came to me doing my story, it was really wonderful because I was able to kind of sit down with him and really talk about that. And that is why you got the interesting cover that you have, because we kind of painted the picture. And literally, that is really what they made them do. That was a part of the story that they didn't really want them to really be athletes. It was all designed for the owner to make money. Let's exploit them. Let's put them in this outfit and have them playing with the yarn ball, which is crazy in a way. But again, that's why in the story, I really got the readers to see, again, they may have wanted it to be to do this, but I'm going to utilize this opportunity to achieve some of my goals. And so we really had a lot of great discussions about the creativity of it. And Mark would actually go back and look at, the costumes of the Dolly Varden. That's based on a character from Charles Dickinson's story. And so that is how we kind of came up with the costumes. And then he would actually take pictures of me for certain expressions, like in the last shot, for people who don't see the two when they're looking at each other, because he really wanted to kind of capture that surprise and that, there's a secret and now everybody finally knows it, because the big secret is not revealed until the end of the story.
Right. Which means you have to go out and read it so that you'll know what it is. We don't want to give those things away. There's a lot. So that it's a fascinating thing to think about the pairing of the story with the illustrations in your particular case. And so that's one of the joys of looking at the Dolly Varden book is the illustrations that go with it. Andrea, when we're looking at your book is about Effa, but it is also about, it's not just a biography of Effa, right? You've put her in the context of, and yet it is Effa's story. And for those who may not know, Effa's story is in and of itself has some interesting pieces to it, right? And so how did you deal with some of the questions about, particularly given the age you were writing for, some of the questions about Effa's background?
Yeah, that's a good question. I honestly just sat down to write the true version of the story. I really didn't think about, whether we needed to adjust things or massage things because of, the age of the readers. I mean, certainly the actual writing itself, I kept that in mind throughout the process. But in terms of the content, I was really intentional about telling the truth. I mean, this is, you know, my book is upper middle grade. So we're talking 10 to 14. And I mean, I have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old, and these kids pay attention. Like they, you know, as much as we try to like shield from them or want to like protect them from, they are paying attention and they understand. And I really, with coming into this with the intent, you know, not just of sharing Effa's story, but in also telling the truth about our past, like talking about stories, you know, sharing stories that haven't been shared before, not especially not from this perspective, right? Like there are a billion Jackie Robinson books, but most of the time they are, you know, they're kind of told, even if Jackie is the star, if he's the protagonist, there's still a heavy emphasis on Branch Rickey and, you know, him saving, you know, baseball and opening the door for this Black man where there, you know, the door had been closed before. And then, oh, what was it like for Jackie's teammates to now be in the dugout with this Black guy? And so we're getting that story now. Mm-hmm. From people who had been previously on the periphery when these stories were told before. So all of that, keeping in mind, you know, that, yeah, when we talk about history, particularly for kids, we do it in these snapshots. And how does it all link together? Let's not just get Jackie Robinson's story from the perspective of those on the other side, from the perspective of the Negro League team that had to figure out how to move on after he was stolen and they weren't paid for his contract, but also how does that work in with what was happening, you know, during World War II, which really drives, you know, which really pushes forward this effort for integration, all these things, linking it together, and keeping that in mind, again, because we talk a lot about the issues, you know, in public schools and where does the history curricula fail us? You know, this is a way to kind of plug some of those holes. And so for that, it is important to tell the truth, right? Like if we look at everything that is happening, you know, in our world, in our society right now, in 2020 with protests and all of these things happening, I really think we're a lot of times dealing with adults who just don't know, right? If I'm going to think the best of people, it's that they don't really understand how this nation was built. Because if you really understand that, you know that it's functioning as it was designed to, and then you understand what needs to be done properly and with intention to tear it down and fix it. So all of that I'm thinking about as I come to this work, and we can't, again, if I'm going to equip the kids who will later be in the front offices, who will later be, you know, on Capitol Hill and are making the decisions that will lead, you know, our communities and our country into the future, we got to tell the truth now, right? Like it's tough sometimes, you know, but we, again, like kids, they can handle as much as we put on them, and we only do them and ourselves a disservice when we try to, you know, hide certain things or not tell the truth about them.
Absolutely. And so an important, and your book does that. Having read it, it does it very, very well. And so yours is looking at time period of the 1930s and 40s and women's and things. And Dr. Brinson's, yours is looking, of course, at the Reconstruction period and immediately thereafter. And so also, obviously, an important historical period. And so setting your story into that historical context, how do you do that?
Just as Andrea says, my book is historical fiction because there's not a lot known about the Dolly Vardys, but there are a lot of factual pieces in that story. And so again, even in having that discussion when we're talking about the Philadelphia Dolly Vardys and the uniform that they wore, you know, it was kind of explained how that happened. And as I said before, it was explained why they wore that. But then I also put in as many factual pieces of information as possible. There is information about some of the Negro League baseball teams at the time, some of the men teams. And then also, I won't give away the whole thing, but when they go to this secret event, all of them, it's on a Thursday night. Why? Because typically Thursday nights were the nights that a lot of African Americans got off, you know, if they were domestic workers. And so again, I'm like Andrea, is historical fiction because there's not a lot known about the Philadelphia Dolly Vardys, and it gave me a chance to address just what she talked about, some of the conflict and the unfair things that are going on right now. So I was able to put all of those factual things in. And as I said too, I was also able to convey that just like unfair things happened to them then, they're still happening now, but you have choices. And so I really wanted to make it clear that you don't fight fire with fire, but you fight fire with strategic action plans that are going to send you to where your goal is. So it gave me an opportunity to really put in a lot of those proactive practices that this generation can use, and the affirmations that are really going to get you where you're going, despite others who are purposely trying to prohibit you from that. So I don't want, when Andrea started talking about what was happening there, I was like, oh gosh, we'll be here until 12 if I get started. So I don't want to start on it a lot, but it is so true. When you talk about the institutional marginalization that is still going on. And again, that goes back to what I referred to with the school to prison pipelines, and really doing just what she's saying. We really got to eradicate and shatter the institutional marginalization so that people really can have those fair opportunities to strive. Now, however, and this is something that I talked to with my white colleagues at the university, and they're like, well, I really want to try to get, them to understand, well, the reality is when it comes to the mainstream, we don't have time to wait for people to get that aha moment. When I say that, so to speak, as far as others having fair opportunities, if they get it, great, but time's up. We can't wait any longer. This generation should not be sacrificed. Nobody in it. All of our children, we talk about our children and our young adults, they all should have the privilege of having the opportunity to be their best authentic selves. And so again, for me, I definitely, as she said, that's the historical part. People need to know what was happening then. And also, I think one of the assets of my book is even during that time, with all of the barriers and with all of the attempts to oppress, they were smart enough, they had the ingenuity and the resilience to figure out how to actually move forward and advance.
And both of your stories tell that, the opportunities, and these are important parts of the history that have not been told, right? That have been left out.
I say all the time, I mean, again, like, and I see this like in having kids, but if you look at typically like at the history textbooks, like the stories that we go the deepest on for Black kids, it's like Black people were either on a plantation or they are being chased by hoses and dogs. So this is an opportunity. I mean, yes, Black people were around in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And guess what? We ran businesses. And guess what? We allowed women to come in and take leadership roles too. So all of that is important. All of that, again, like I just can't stress enough. It doesn't just help us fill in the gaps of the past, like help us learn these stories that we hadn't heard. It really helps us to think forward in a different way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because again, if you don't know these stories, you don't know what's possible, right? And you don't realize the opportunities. Both of you have mentioned, though, and particularly in your case, Dr. Brinson, the issue of the research. And so I'd like to ask you both to tell us a little about your research process, what it was like, what some of the challenges were and the difficulties. How did you, because these are stories that aren't easy to find and aren't easy to tell. And so I'm going to start with Dr. Brinson, since you're looking at a team from the 1880s, right, playing in Philadelphia. What was the research like? What was that process?
Well, I kind of explained some how, I was looking at the Negro Baseball Leagues, and there was, adequate research on it. But from that, when I discovered the Philadelphia Dolly Vardens, once I found there was only a little bit of information, but when I kind of found that little bit of information and it told the story about the owner doing it to exploit and using, the costume from the character, I did the research on those kinds of things. And then once I did that and looked at the time frame, that actually gave me insight into, as I told you, some of the other younger Negro baseball teams. And so when I found that information, and some of that is in there too, like Andrea was saying, there's a lot of factual information. And so when I started thinking about the Philadelphia Dolly Vardens, I of course said, well, my next step is let me research other Negro teams that are going on at that same time. And so I was able to find out information about the Moravians and the Pythians, and to actually put in some of those things that really happened to them. Right. And that's that historical piece. And for me, going back to what you're saying when they're younger, yes, even with our younger children, they really can get information about the history, because I literally put in things that happened to those teams and then what they did to resolve that. So again, the research was, I started with one place that led me to another. Once I got to that place with the Philadelphia Dolly Vardens, I wanted to see what else was going on in Philadelphia, and then along with Philadelphia with the other teams that were around in that age and during that time and during that era.
Okay. Research. What was the research process like for you, Andrea?
Yeah, it really, because I came in, having worked at the museum and having really have this strong foundation in the history, I think Bob gave me that one tour and I was given tours the next day, which is kind of scary now that I think about it. But, we had a traveling exhibit that went around, to different baseball stadiums every weekend during the summer. And one of us, myself, Bob or Ray, were there, and we had to answer questions and take, do interviews. So the foundation was there. I say, like, as a journalist, I know in other books that I work on, like, a lot of times you get into the research and part of the early research is just trying to find the story. So I knew the story that I wanted to tell, and I had a general structure. It was just really fleshing it out, particularly for kids because you need those scenes, right? Like it's mine is definitely nonfiction, but you want it to read like a novel for kids so that they're interested and want to keep turning the page. And so, yeah, it was a lot of Black newspapers. I literally would not have been able to write this book if it was not for, the Courier and the Defender and these papers that covered, these athletes in these games and these teams when white papers weren't interested. It's also really interesting, which we kind of see now with like the Players Tribune, like giving the athletes a voice. But with the Black newspapers, then, we have these executives, right? Like Composey is pissed about something. He can go write about it in the Pittsburgh Courier because his dad is like a part owner in the paper. Or, Gus Greenlee is like pushed out of baseball. He goes and freaking writes a column about it. So, it's exciting. We can see a lot of these interpersonal dynamics play out in the press. Jackie takes to the pages of Ebony magazine and like completely trashes the Negro Leagues in 1948. And then here's Effa running to the press. So that was a really good way of, again, digging into this story and telling a deeper story than we've previously been told, right? Like, yes, people were excited because Jackie got to go and play, for the Dodgers in Major League Baseball, but there were a lot of people who weren't quite so excited, at least not in the way it was not about the way it was done. And then, of course, Effa, she just left us this treasure trove of stuff, right? Like she leaves Newark and, moves out to California after Abe passes away and just leaves all of her files, like everything. And, I guess the new owners who came in took it right over to the Newark Public Library. So we have all of that. So again, particularly when we're talking about, the interpersonal dynamics, really understanding who Effa was as a person, her personality, like, you can really get a good sense of who she was, this woman who like is not afraid to say what's on her mind, who will step up to the men. You can see that in her letters. Like you can see like when she's writing to Don Newcomb's parents and is like, I am not giving your son a raise. By the way, he was trash last year. So like we get all of that. And yeah, it totally helps the research. I can't imagine what Dr. Brinson was going through. Cause even in this book, there was a lot of like back and forth with the editor because my editor was like, we really should get this scene right here. Like, let's get the end game action that happened. And I'm like, we don't have that, right? Like, or, these situations where it's like, you want to really provide an accurate accounting for kids who don't have any, Negro Leagues experience. Like, how do you explain really how good Oscar Charleston was? Or, and you got, some stats over here and this, and there was, I relied on seam heads a lot. But there, it's difficult again, because there are just so many gaps in the history. And a lot of that is because, again, it was just the Black papers covering Negro Leagues baseball. And, a lot of them were only published weekly. So yeah, there's a lot of gaps. I mean, there's a part of, Effa's story in the book is how she's getting on the other owners because they weren't, basically reporting stats and game logs in a timely fashion and weren't reporting them accurately, right? Like She's like accusing Composy of lying about what's happening in the game so that at the end, when we file, when we decide, the standings for the end of the season, he's trying to make the grades look better. So all of these things we have to keep in consideration, but yeah.
And so you're rightly telling that. I remember reading about Rube Foster and C.I. Taylor having their debates in the paper.
Yes, in the paper. Rube Foster and Ed Bolden. Rube's like, okay, I'm over here trying to create something for Black people, and you're in partnership on the East Coast with the white guy. What's going on? And then Ed Bolden's like, so you're not in partnership with, how do you have access to the stadium that you have access to? So yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Yeah.
And so, Dr. Brinson, you didn't have any of that, right? I mean, you don't even have articles that gave you necessarily any real details about these ladies that were playing beyond their names and their uniforms, right?
Yeah, there was just a very little information, but again, going back to what Andrea says, and when we're telling the stories and filling in the gaps, it was important for me to make sure that people understood that these were multidimensional characters, in the story that reflected multidimensional people. And as she kind of identified, more times than not, when you see characters, African-American, there's kind of just like the one side to them. And typically, they're not strong at all, being some kind of target or whatever. And so again, that's why I go back to, I took a little bit of information that I did have. And a part of that was just that they wanted to just use these women to exploit them. Mm-hmm. And so again, I said, okay, but if these are strong, skilled athletes, what would a strong, skilled athlete do? And that's the story that I showed, that if you are, then you, again, you can't win by trying to fight against the owner with that part, but you can use your ingenuity and your resilience, and you can still, as I said, meet your goals in that. And then not only just with that particular one, there are the other avenues that were kind of highlighted from that. And so even in the cover, I kind of mentioned it again, how intriguing it was. Andrea talked about that a little bit. Even with my editors, they were like, I don't really get upset. Well, I had to kind of fight a little bit for really showing what was happening. Mm-hmm. They wanted them in these red, gaudy outfits to exploit them, and she was like, well, I'm not sure. I said, no. I said, they need to see the true story. And the other thing I'd like to point out about the cover is too, even the expression on her face. And you were saying that when Mark and I were talking, I said, listen, make sure that it really shows how determined she was. I won't give away, well, you can kind of see who she's playing, but people are like, well, why does she look so angry? That's not anger. And I'll say that too. And a lot of times with people, oh, the angry Black woman, she's not angry, but she's resolved. She's a strong, skilled worker. And I said, Mark, I really want you to capture that in her face, because you see her, she's running to home plate. And so again, as a strong, skilled athlete, who's a woman, who's playing against a male team, she is resolved. And so again, for me, it was like Andrea says, I'm going to take the truth, get as many of those little nuggets that I can, and I'm going to pull together a whole story that really shows what was happening at that time. But again, not the same old kind of, oh, can somebody come and rescue her? Oh, poor, that's so sad. No, these were individuals. During that time, we know how turbulent Reconstructed era was, but they figured it out. And how do we know that they figured it out? Because basically, we're all still here. So they were resilient, they were resolved, they used their ingenuity to really kind of make progress. And just as a side note, Andrea was saying that they do kind of traveling history exhibits and things like that. So during the centennial, we got blocked by COVID, but that was one of the things that I did. As I said, for me, I did a movie screening, and then I had a traveling book exhibit where I kind of put together and laid out information about a lot of the players, the owners, Effa, the Philadelphia Darlie Vardens. And so during one of our screenings, I made it interactive because I also wanted people to see too, just how amazing it was for these players to be playing at that time. And so in the one skit play, I actually had like a little team, because people forget that they had to they had to battle all these other things. For example, you know, on the circuit, you kind of just went, they barnstormed, they kind of just went and played from one to one to one. Well, but guess what? We have sundown towns. So it's like, okay, and I'm in Springfield, Missouri. And so when you think about that, it's like, okay, so you can't be in that town when the sun comes down. So what do you do? So it was also a time to kind of introduce the Green Book and let people know that, for those who don't know, that's the book that kind of listed the logic and the places you could go. Well, the reality is, was there a place for African Americans to stay in every town? No. And so in my one-act play, going back to the writings you were saying, in the play, I really kind of showed that part that they had just finished the game. They were in a sundown town. And so I kind of had to, it showed in the play that they basically had to kind of just sleep in their cars. And with that, though, in the scene, I made a point of showing that while two slept, two had to stay awake. Why? Because again, we're talking about African-American players sitting there, they're pretty much sitting ducks. And so for me, that was important. And in that one-night play too, I made a point of saying that it was one male, one woman. They were sitting there and they kind of had to guard what was happening before they could then get up and travel to the next place. And just as a side note, I used Springfield. And again, in talking about the athletes, but just when we come to history, that was our athlete, that was our entertainers, whoever you can think of. For example, Nat King Cole, who was an entertainer, he was traveling around from different towns to towns to towns. And of course, he was in one town and ended up getting beat up, you know, by people who did not want him there. So all of those things really have to be told. Now, are we saying we're going to scare them and all? It's written in a developmentally appropriate way for our children, as particularly even in the elementary schools. Why? Because people have to understand what the history is. If you're really going to respect and connect and really be educated on American history, all of that information has to come out. And as Andrea said, why does it have to come out? Because, and I tell people that all the time, people, well, if we're not careful, things will go back to the way they are. Well, in reality, no, they won't go back. They've never really been resolved and eradicated in the way that they should. And that just goes back to me again with wanting to have stories that children are interested in so that all of our children have those opportunities to thrive and to advance in elementary school.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can hear, hopefully, as you're listening, the resounding message that is carried through both of your books, right? In terms of thinking about this. I want to remind everybody who's listening, if you have questions, to please start throwing them in the chat. And if there are questions that you want to ask, that's how we're going to do this. We're going to give you an opportunity to do that. But while you're thinking about that, I just want to ask Andrea and Sabrina, the sort of, so you both had books come out in a rather unfortunate time period in terms of thinking about so Andrea, how did that, your book just came out, right? How is that playing out? How difficult has that been? What have you been doing to try to work around this pandemic that is when your book came out?
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, obviously I'm not like on, a physical book tour, but my team at Roaring Brook and Macmillan has been really, really great. Actually working with an outside publicity team that's been putting together like a virtual radio tour. So I've done lots of stuff, which, is exciting. People also, it is February, it's Black History Month. So, so this is a way to, expand the conversation beyond, MLK and Malcolm X and Rosa Parks. So, but yeah, there has been a lot of interest. I've done, I'm somewhat active on Twitter. And so I've had, people reach out to me and ask me to do podcasts. So it hasn't been terrible. I am a homebody anyway. And like, you can't, I've got the whole like business up top and party down below with sweats and bare feet here. So I can do that in a pandemic. Right. So yeah, it's, I understand, like, even just when I have purchased books, I can't always get out to the physical, if someone's coming in town to do a reading, but like virtual things like this, or seeing them talk about their book or write a piece, or seeing someone else write a piece. I had a piece that you sent me, Leslie, that ran, in the Chicago Sun-Times last week. So I think it's going as well as can be expected, maybe even a little better. Again, my team is hopeful too that, as we go into March, which is Women's History Month, and then, April is the start of baseball season. And then this summer, this is the 15-year anniversary of Effa's induction. So there are lots of opportunities all along the way. And I've been busy with a lot of other things, but I plan on, writing some other pieces too that help people connect to the book that maybe haven't yet. So yeah, it's going, but I get to stay in sweats, and I'm not mad at that.
And I think you saw some thumbs up on that one. How about for you, Dr. Brinson? Same, because
same thing. Well, like I said, we have to practice what we preach. So again, one of the messages of the book is the resilience and ingenuity. And that's pretty much what I've done, just been resilient and figuring out a variety of ways, as Andrea said, so a lot of blogs and webinars, and also one of the things that I talked about too, because I'm always trying to extend it, this book will be the first of a series. Now, it's not a series that you would typically think of as in more about the Philadelphia Darling Runners. There may be one or two more things, but the series that I'm putting together now is basically reading for ingenuity and resilience. And so in that series, there are going to be other books about other people from diverse population who've done these amazing things in history. And so right now I'm already setting up partnerships and establishing collaboration. So for example, with public school libraries, that's going to be something that we do here in Springfield, other places, but in Springfield, we're going to launch that series that we're going to be doing. Because again, in thinking about it, and this actually happened last year, right when I knew it was getting ready to come out, and I was at the library, and I would notice, that they would have the different reading clubs for children to come to. Reading clubs are great. And as I told you all, I read everything, even cereal box tops. But again, we really were missing, we were missing some opportunities. We weren't making it as inclusive as possible. And what do I mean by that? I go back to the children who really engage in illiteracy. I'm not motivated to read. So I started to watch that, and I talked to our local librarians, and they're like, yeah, we've got the reading program, you motivate the kids and da-da-da-da-da. And I looked at the book list, and again, they're great. They're wonderful. They're fine. But for me, it's like, let's now pull together this series where two things are going to happen simultaneously. Some of the children will get to see positive reflections of themselves. Others will get insight into the multiple facets and the achievements of people who are different from themselves. So that is something that we have been setting up and we'll be doing in the summer, which will be really great. So even in the midst of the COVID, there are the they wear their mask, they come in, but they can come in and get the books. And then we have incentives. I'm also going to do a lot of the trainings by Zoom. Mm-hmm. And with that, so as the librarians come in and different staff, they can be trained on that. And also, being a university professor, I collaborate with some of the other universities around here. And I'm going to be doing some other kind of professional interactive workshops as far as how to actually utilize my book. Because again, the goal is to say, here's the book, here's how you can utilize it. And it was designed for rereadings, because after you read the story, there's information at the end that poses some questions. And so that's really neat, because now they can go back and reread it, and now they have insight because they're looking for different things. So it gives the readers more opportunities to have ownership. It gives the readers more opportunities to comprehend, and it also gives the readers more opportunities to really kind of talk about some of the experiences that they see along the way. So I think I agree with Andrea that, it's kind of like the lemonade. It's still coming out.
Well, that's good. That's good. That's very encouraging. That's really good to hear because they're certainly worthwhile books. So Dr. Brinson, you're telling us a little bit about what's coming next for you. What's coming next for you, Andrea?
I definitely remember talking about this last time, and the very next book still has not been announced yet. I think like a couple weeks now, honestly, I saw a markup of the cover today. It's getting close, but yeah, so I think by the end of March for sure, my very next thing will be announced. It's fiction. It is for kids, but it's still in the sports space. And then I am working on the follow-up to Effa. So that one, none of this stuff has been announced yet. This is the thing with publishing, right? I always tell people, my number one tip, get somebody you can tell the secrets to, because publishing won't let you say anything for like years. So, so there is a upper middle grade nonfiction follow-up to the Effa Manley project. It's not a sequel or anything, but it is, again, how do we talk about some of these moments in history through the lens of characters or people who we haven't heard from before. And then I'm working on some adult stuff too. So I'm kind of all over. Listen, I wish I was writing. I'm supposed to say, oh my gosh, I've written so much because we're in a pandemic and I'm at home and there's nowhere to go. And no, it's not happening. I'm in sweats and still not writing. So I don't know what's happening here, but hopefully, yes, this next book will be announced very soon. And then, yeah, I think 22 is when we, that could very well change. But the last time I spoke with my editor, that was what we were thinking for the follow-up. So
that's awesome. So now you've given us something to look forward to. So Dr. Brinson, there's a question in the chat and somebody was just wondering, you had mentioned your one-act play. Was that something that is available or was that something that was just done one time?
Oh, well, I'm the author. So, if
people are wondering if it's out there to be seen.
Actually, well, if they really are interested, they have the two ways of reaching me. Of course, they can go to my website, drbrinsonbrand.com or whatever, and I'll be happy to reach out about that because, again, and I'm glad they asked about that because that's something else too. It kind of gives people insight into really what were those struggles. So people think about, oh, well, just the struggles of playing in that, but no, there was so much more to it. And as I said, I did it at a university. And so I even had, when people came in, when they were coming to it, on the doors, I even had put on the two doors, white only, sundown town. So people really got those experiential experiences to really understand all of the different challenges that our players had to deal with and contend with, not just on the field. And I wanted to show that because I wanted to show the other part too, that not only did they make amazing achievements to history on the field, but also in other aspects as far as the civil rights and things. So if someone is interested, please go to my website or my email address, and I will be happy to share it with you. Also give you insight into the collection I put together for the traveling book history, which is really great because that too shows just Andrea mentioned a lot of players who people have never heard of. People typically know Jackie Robinson, but as she says, Oscar Charleston and people like that, they don't really know the history of them. And even with the ones that they do know, now I'll even say this about Jackie Robinson, most people don't know, the different facets that he had when it came to contributing to the civil rights movement off of the field. He was a part of a construction company that actually built homes for African Americans and a part of a bank. And so him and some of the others, in that screening that I did too, I talked about some of the struggles that Josh Gibson went through off the field. So if people are interested, I will be happy to pull together resources for them. And I would be happy to share the one-act play because from the feedback I got, people got more information from that than anything else. And it also did something else. It also kind of moved forward, these discussions that we have to have. But like I tell people, I said, there's a difference between, I say, be aware of talk. There's a difference between just talking and talking and talking, or talk that leads to strategic plans as far as action steps. And so we really were successful and people coming together and saying, okay, listen, this is really going on. How can I address that? So I felt like it really was insightful in really getting people to understand what the experiences were back then. And unfortunately, what are some of those same types of experiences for some of our students in our diverse populations. And the populations I named, those 4 target groups, we really have to pay attention and make sure that we have wraparound services to make sure that they have the opportunities to continue to advance forward. And my last note would be, because people think about the cognitive part, but a lot of this, my books and the messages of ingenuity and resilience, has to do with the social and the emotional development too.
Sure.
That we don't think enough about, but of course, social and emotional development is interconnected with the academic achievements. And of course, for me, I do research on social, emotional, and even moral development, because I think we forget that basically no child is born with hate. When we talk about sexism or ableism or racism, they have to be taught that. So just as they are taught those unsavory things, and again, my book does that, it really instills in them and teaches them how to develop a strong moral compass, how to, rather than, as I say, don't fight fire with fire, instead fight it with positive pro-action steps. So in other words, there's a solution to every problem, but every solution isn't a good one. We want you to make sure that you can identify good solutions and move forward that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, but if anybody's got one, this is your one. Instead, I'm seeing Andrea and Sabrina are lots of compliments and great working with the teachers and the libraries. You're going to get some potential invites out of this one, it looks like. But there's a question. There seems to be conflicting information about Effa's ancestry. And so they're wondering about that particular question and how you settled on the question of Effa's ancestry.
Yeah. So in the book, I essentially lay out the facts that we have. I think, generally, historians all agree that her father was white, that her mother had Thank you, Anika. Anika says, read the book.
Right.
No, but there, we agree that her father was white. And then while Effa's, her personal background is a bit murky, we also have census records that state that her mother was mulatto. She wasn't, fully African-American, but she was mulatto. And so then that ultimately means that Effa does have some Blackness, right? And so for the purposes of the book, I just lay that out. I definitely, this is the era of passing. And so, I bring up the fact that her mother probably, wants a better life for her daughter, right? If you have the option to live in this other world, then maybe you should take it, right? She is, I'm a mom, I want better for my kids, right? But we know that Effa, who grew up in this family with, Black siblings who lived in a Black community, she remained with the Black community throughout her life and career, even as, when she traveled, she would stay in a white only hotel or eat at a white only restaurant. But when in having these larger conversations, I also mentioned that I personally, I think it's interesting that, and part of this too is, Effa did an interview, towards the end of her life where she mentions that she's white. She's a bit unreliable in that way. She also said in that interview that she was born in 1900, and we know she's not. And we're not, arguing back and forth about, well, was it 1897 or 1900? Because Effa said, but what I really think it comes down to, and this is why it's important, I think, that we don't get the same stories told over and over by the same people or people from the same backgrounds. Because when I listen to that interview and I hear her tell this white man, I hear her offer up this information to this white man and saying that she's white, I hear a woman who has used her fair skin to her benefit throughout her life and is continuing to keep up that front for this white man who was talking to her about her life and career at the end of her life. But I think it's interesting though that we question these census records. We question that Effa, all of her marriages, to these multiple men, she puts that she's Black on every marriage certificate. We question that this woman who was Black and who could pass would not, right? Because again, in that era of passing, so many people did, because why would you want to subject yourself to the second class status that Black people had to live within? And so we would rather assume that this was a woman who was white who performed Blackness instead of the other way around. So in answering these questions, I kind of like kick it back to that. Now we know that like she's had family members, like I think it was her niece who later said, okay, she was definitely not a white woman. Monty Irvin later, in his book says, listen, when you see this woman as she ages, you can tell that she's not white. But I think it means something that we assume that she must have been a white woman performing Blackness, because why, if she was Black and could pass, why wouldn't she have passed? Right. I think that says something about us and, as a society, as a culture, and what, how white supremacy and these notions of what is best or what is ideal, how that impacts all of us, right? We see that, even in the history of the Negro Leagues, I brought up, the point, once Major League Baseball says, I'm elevating the status, we're elevating the status of the Negro Leagues. And now, these players, Josh Gibson's stats will stand alongside Babe Ruth and everything. And so many people, and I understand why, but so many people were like, we don't need, Major League Baseball to say that. And I'm like, maybe you don't in 2020, but some people needed that. Some Black people needed that in 1945, 46, 47, because when we had an option, when we had power, and yet were the Negro Leagues perfect? Not by any stretch. In the same way, Major League Baseball wasn't perfect before they pulled in Kennesaw Landis to clean it up. There were a lot of problems within Black baseball, but we had ownership and we had power. And far and away, the Black players wanted to be on the white side of the ball, 100%. So I think those are questions that if we're really going to be honest about history, again, this is what it's all about. If we're going to be honest and we're going to interrogate the past, and then we're going to look at how that impacts the today so that we can move forward into the future, we got to talk about these things. Why are we assuming, when we have this data, when we have this information, why are we still assuming that she must have been a white woman? So it's a long answer, but
no, that's great. Thank you. So there is one more question that we see in the chat, and it starts by saying, thank you for your writing about these leaders and your deep research. Do you have any recommendations for teachers, history groups, baseball, about how to encourage community learning from your books and creating more opportunities that celebrate these women in baseball? Any suggestions?
What was the last? Just repeat the last part.
Sure. Create suggestions for creating more opportunities that celebrate these women in baseball.
Sure. And for me, going back to being a community activist, and it sounds simple, but it really does work. It's literally getting out into the community, finding out about different organizations that are already established in those communities. Let's say, for an example, one might be finding out if there is a local NAACP branch of it, or a National Action League network or something like that. Going to your libraries too, finding out what they already have, because that's what I did. I went to the library first to saw what they already had, and then I wanted to look at the gaps. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that part is really important. When we talk about collaborations, I think university, home, school, and community. So again, not just community types of organizations, but also organizations for parents and organizations for children that they may have. So you can start with those, see what they already have on their agenda, and then look for opportunities to infuse some of these informative types of activities. Again, have we been successful enough to get away from celebrating Black History Month or Women's Month? No. So it's really great that we do these things during these times, But that would be the first thing to say, okay, we've gotten things that we do during, Black History Month. And of course, we need to do the same thing during Women's, but to do just what I said. So when I wrote this book, again, it's going to be the first one in a series that's going to continue to highlight and provide information. Now, I'm writing different books, but even in addition to that, there really are also some wonderful books. Typically the term used to be multicultural. They all mean the same thing, but it's kind of an example because now we call them culturally responsive, culturally sustaining. And my point to it is they have different names, but we really have not utilized them the way that we should. So my first comment would be that first and foremost, if you do have a book about an African-American character, not every book is going to be a great book. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is find what I call high quality books. Well, what does that mean? It means that it is a well-written story, and kind of the things that we talked about. Mine has historical fiction in it, but there's a lot of accurate information in it. There are a lot of positive reflections. There are proactive solutions to the problems. And if it has pictures, are they complementary pictures to the stories? So that would be the first thing to do, is to just kind of say, in my area, let me think about it. And when I do that, for example, I teach a diversity class. And when I'm doing the training on that, we get to the discussion, so to speak. And so I tell them, I said, okay, class, I said, let's just see. Basically, I said, when it comes to looking at our diverse populations that we have, I say, I'll even let you guys do it as a group. And I asked this simple question. And it's actually a question that came from a research study that I did. And the title of the story was Knowledge of Multicultural Literature Among Early Childhood Educators. Because again, everybody knows the rhetoric. We all talk about, we value diversity, we welcome everybody. So when I did the study, it was a very simple study in that I posed questions to in-service early childhood educators and pre-service. And all I asked them to do was identify 2 books that have the main characters for, first, of course, European American, which would be the mainstream. Then identify 2 books where the main characters are African Americans, 2 books where the main characters are Latino American, Native American, and biracial. Just 2 books for our kid. And guess what? You know what? Nobody could do it. The closest they got was being able to identify 1 book where African Americans were the main character. And so again, it's a good question that she has. Don't be fooled. It's like, but we have all these books and things that are here. Well, yes and no. Right. A lot of times people, it goes back to, like I say, don't understand the importance of it. People still with it doesn't make a difference. Yeah, it does. And so the other example that I give is I put up a slideshow of Cinderella, because again, when you asked me at the beginning, we really want to encourage our children as soon as possible, as young as possible, to get into reading and writing. And so I put up a screen that has all of these Cinderellas, and they're all, of course, from the mainstream, because we all know there are a gazillion stories about Cinderella. Well, so I put up the one with all of the ones with the mainstream, and I say, okay, so if we really are practicing what we preach, if we really are have inclusion, I flipped the next PowerPoint screen that shows pictures of somebody, a Cinderella from the mainstream with red hair, the Korean Cinderella, the Adelita Cinderella, the Gospel Cinderella. And my question is, how come we don't see this then? How come if you go into a preschool or an early childhood classroom, or sometimes even in our libraries, we don't see those things? So again, to answer her question, I always say start wherever you are in the process. If you know of a local organization or something that might be open and interested to it, start with them. Junior leagues, NAACPs, different fraternities and sororities that are in your areas, or as I said, even broach the libraries, because That's what I did. We have our meetings there. We do a lot with them as far as voter registration and getting children to get library cards. So start there. And once you start there, that's where you can really say, okay, we really want to get some of these high quality books in that reflect all of our children and that give all of our children opportunities to get insight into the lives of others.
Thanks. Those are all great ideas and great opportunities. I think what we're hearing is that we're starting to see with books like yours that there are books that are coming out that are of high quality that are going to fill these gaps, and you're going to continue to write more of them for us and tell
Yes.
more stories. So I don't see any further, and I said that would be the last question. So I want to thank both Andrea and Sabrina tonight for sharing with us your insights and your comments about your books. This was wonderful, great conversation. And I would encourage everyone, if you have not gotten the books yet, to go out and get them and read them. You will be amazed at the stories that you're going to hear. And it will encourage you to go out and learn more. So we're seeing lots of thank yous to both of you. So thank you very, very much for coming and joining us tonight. We did record this, so it will be available on the SABR website in the next couple days. And so we'll make sure that you get the links for that, but you can check out their books. Real quick, Sabrina and Andrea, best places where people can go get your books?
For me, on my website, www.drbrinsonbrand.com. You can go on and it gives you information about the book. It also has information about the series that I talked about. So the person who wanted to know that question about the series that I'm starting, the Ingenuity and Resilience. And it also, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but it also gives people information about my national literacy programs, which are Boys Booked on Barbershops and Girls Booked on Beautyshops. And those programs were started when we talked about places in the community for just that reason. Barbershops and beauty shops have been staples of our communities for generations. And so again, what we do is we go into those, we partner with different organizations, and we actually go into the communities. And again, here's the difference, because I'm the founder and national director. So what I do is I talk to someone in that shop and I say, tell me about your regular patrons. I want to know the ages and what ethnic groups they come from. And so then based on that, what we do is we put in a reading nook with books that I personally select that are high quality books for the students to read while they're there. The beauty of it is, if it's the little boy or girl coming for their first haircut or get their hair groomed, mother, father, sister, whoever brings them in can read the story, because I have developmentally appropriate, with just a few sentences, and the books go all the way up. So if you've got middle, third and fourth graders who can kind of read themselves, or even for our high schoolers. So we go all the way from easy picture books to chapter books. The other great thing about that is where the involvement comes. We have sororities and fraternities, and all kinds of organizations are the ones who fund those books to go in. And the best thing about it is, once they get into the barber or the beautician's chair, that barber or beautician says, okay, now tell me about that book that you were reading. So there's that follow through. And my last comment would be, how do we know it works? Because of course, they have a hard time keeping the books in the barbershops.
And Anika just put your website in the chat. So thank you, Anika, for doing that. And of course, your book, Andrea, would fit beautifully into all of that. It's the perfect age and all of those. So any last comments on from you, Andrea?
Yeah, it's my book is available wherever books are sold. If you're interested in a signed copy, my local indie Parnassus Books. When the book came out, I went and signed quite a bit of stock, and hopefully they don't have any. Let me stop. I was going to say they should have a lot, but maybe they don't. Hopefully they have none, and they're going to call me after this, because everybody's going to go order, and I'm going to have to go back and sign some more. So let's do that. I'll go back and sign some more, and then we'll send out signed copies for Parnassus. But no, it's available Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever books are sold.
And again, and you could put that in the chat for us too, Parnassus Books, so that you can get a signed copy of it. So now you know where to go and get these books, and we'll have more to look forward to. So again, thank you so much to both of you for sharing with us tonight. We really, really appreciate it. And good luck moving forward with these books and the ones that are coming next. We'll look forward to seeing those as well. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Leslie. This was wonderful.
Welcome.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.
Everyone be safe and be well.
Absolutely.
Thank you.